The Montana Department of Natural Resources and Conservation, known as DNRC, helps protect around 60 million acres of private and state-owned land from wildfires. One major hurdle with Montana's wildfire protection is that its funding system has remained largely unchanged for over 50 years. This is despite a significant increase in the risk of wildfires and the corresponding expectations for the DNRC's response. Here at the Legislative Audit Division, we've identified several ways to modernize the fire assessment program. We believe these changes would better reflect today's reality, encourage more cost-effective wildfire protection, and make the system easier to manage. I'm content editor and host Eric Seidel, and I'm here with one of the authors of the report, titled Modernizing Montana's Wildfire Assessment Program, Kenneth Caden Noggings. Join us over the next few minutes as we talk about and summarize our report, and hopefully you can gain a better understanding of the Wildfire Assessment Program. And with all that said, here we go. Caden, thanks for joining me today and being willing to talk all things Wildfire Assessment Program.
Yeah, happy to be here.
Caden, if you wouldn't mind giving me some background or building off that intro and telling me and the listeners a little bit about what the Wildfire Assessment Program is.
The Department of Natural Resources and Conservation is currently responsible for wildfire protection of all state and private property in Montana. That includes things like responding to active wildfires, but also mitigation efforts to help prevent future fires, as well as the maintenance and training that supports those functions.
Can you give me an idea about the cost? It seems like every year Montana's battling a wildfire. It can't be cheap.
Yeah, so protection is a pretty large expense for the state. It's spent about $41.1 million on routine expenses in fiscal year 2023.
Okay, so now that we know some of the cost, how or who pays for that?
Part of the state's funding for wildfire protection comes from a special assessment on specific landowners who live in classified forest land. This is in recognition of the fact that wildfire threat varies wildly across the state. So, for example, a home in the prairie in the east of the state, or in pine forests in the west of the state, or in downtown Helena, each would have very different wildfire risk profiles. At the moment, only one of those homes would likely pay the fire assessment fee because it's mostly based in forested areas in the west of the state.
Okay, so you gave an example of three different risk profiles and are saying it's most likely that the forested home would end up paying that assessment. How is it calculated?
So statute has a requirement for how much individuals can be charged and for how much total can be collected. For now, let's focus on the total revenue. Statute requires that the total revenue from the fee be no greater than 1/3 of the state's wildfire protection expenditure. There's been some confusion around this statutory requirement, and the department has historically only considered their readiness budget when determining the maximum allowable fee revenue. However, we feel that statute is pretty clear in this section that wildfire protection includes readiness, mitigation, and suppression.
Okay, and what areas did your audit report focus on?
Our audit focused on two things. Is the wildfire protection assessment fee being administered and collected in accordance with statute and administrative rule? And does Montana's funding structure and distribution of resources align with best practices for fire preparedness?
Okay, so now that we know that the two areas you focused on, it really sounds like the funding part was kind of the meat of the report. Do you want to start there?
Yeah, so the most important thing there is that because of the current funding structure, the state's protection acts as a subsidy for landowners living in high-risk areas.
Okay, explain to me this whole subsidy thing.
You can think of it like this. The state's wildfire protection provides a monetary benefit to landowners by reducing their potential costs from wildfire damages. The vast majority of this benefit is received specifically by owners of developed properties in high-risk areas. Those are the people who might potentially face major property damage if it weren't for the state's protection. At the same time, currently only around 1/10 of the state's funding for protection comes from the assessment fee. The rest comes from the general taxpayer at large.
Okay, well then if I'm a large forested landowner, how much do taxpayers contribute to my wildfire protection?
Well, on an individual level, it would depend on multiple factors. But collectively, the total fee revenue cap that's currently in statute, 1/3 of the state's total protection expenses, was originally taken from a 1958 study that estimated that private landowners were responsible for 1/3 of wildfire starts.
I mean, that hardly sounds equitable.
So, based on that proportion of responsibility, The cost of the state's subsidy in fiscal year 2023 was about $9.4 million. With that being said, I can't really say what is or isn't equitable.
I mean, $9.4 million, that sounds like a lot of money to me.
Yeah. And actually, during our work, we found that the 1958 Patil study was obviously pretty out of date. On top of that, they weren't really focused on finding this proportion of landowner responsibility. That came tangentially out of other work. We also found that that study was looking at the whole country and wasn't really focused on Montana specifically. We performed a civil methodology on Montana data by counting fire start locations. We found that 92% of wildfires in Montana started on private land, which isn't really surprising given that most of the land in the state is privately owned. Based on that proportion of responsibility, the cost of the state's subsidy would have been $33.5 million in fiscal year 2023.
Okay, and that leads you to, what conclusion?
Ultimately, the state's subsidized wildfire protection encourages more people to move to high fire risk areas, which then leads to the taxpayers having to pay even more to protect those additional people in high risk areas. That system also creates economic inefficiency, which you can read about more in Chapter 2 of the report.
Okay, so now that we get all that, how is it determined who pays the fee?
So statute sets up this district system for the DNRC to use for their direct protection areas and to decide who has to pay the fee. Our work found that those districts were based on historical borders and didn't necessarily conform to fire risk in the state. At the same time, fee amounts within the districts are uniform, even though DNRC gives higher response priority to some properties, like developed residential properties.
Okay, and does that get you to a recommendation?
Yeah, this led us to a recommendation for the legislature to fix these issues. We explored one potential policy option, which you could read about more in Chapter 2 of the report.
Okay, then as we ramp down and get to the end of this report, I know you had an administrative recommendation, one that goes full circle and kind of puts a bow on things and tied back into what we were talking about earlier.
Yeah, we also found that better tracking of the department's protection resources would enable them to do some useful analyses that would also inform some of the decisions related to the districts and fee structure that we just talked about. The last thing we found was that there were also a few more minor operational issues. A small number of special kinds of properties were being assessed incorrect fee amounts. There were opportunities for better automation and quality control in the assessment program in general, and program operations manuals weren't up to date or were, in some cases, not being followed.
All right, well, that's it for us. Caden, thanks for joining me. Thanks for taking time out and explaining, some of the behind-the-scenes things on fighting wildfires, in particular, how it's funded.
Yeah, thanks for having me. It's important that people know as taxpayers what their money is going towards. I hope that the agency found this work valuable and that the legislature will consider our recommendations during their next session.
This episode was on modernizing the wildfire assessment program. If you want to read this or any other audits, our website is being updated, but you can still go to archive.legmt.gov/lad and read up on any of the audit reports that you might have missed. Thanks for listening, and until next time.